Hi everyone, welcome to part 3 of World War I. Our questions to think about here: what were the major provisions of the Treaty of Versailles? Why were they problematic? Why doesn't the United States Senate ratify the Treaty of Versailles? The war officially ends November 11th, 1918, when Kaiser Wilhelm advocated the throne and the new German government surrendered. Germany had to evacuate occupied territories, pull their troops behind the Rhine River, and surrender their naval fleet. The death toll was staggering. The United States, in the short time that it was involved in the war, lost 126,000 soldiers. Germany, however, lost 2 million, including civilians. France, 1.4 million. Great Britain, 700,000. And Russia, 1.7 million. To put this in perspective, both Germany and France lost approximately 20% of their military-aged men. Before the war was over, however, President Woodrow Wilson wanted to make sure that he was involved in whatever sort of peace negotiations were started. And in fact, in January of 1918, Woodrow Wilson is going to put forth a proposal called the 14 Points, in which he is encouraging the European leaders to stop the conflict on the battlefield and to sit down at the peace table. Unfortunately, though, the European powers were not interested in doing that at this point. And so Wilson's 14 points remain sort of an idea, and it's going to be the basis on which the Treaty of Versailles will be built, because Woodrow Wilson is basically going to insist upon it. There are, in fact, 14 points, but when we take a look at this more broadly, we see several themes emerge. First and foremost is this idea of national self-determination, and this means that people should be allowed to rule themselves. So when we take a look at the situation in Austria-Hungary with the Bosnians not having their own country, then this is not self-determination. Those people are not allowed to govern themselves. So this becomes a key issue in the peace settlement. Second, freedom of the seas. And this was especially important for the United States because freedom of the seas, or the lack of freedom of the seas, is the reason why the United States enters this war. Third, the enforcement of peace by a League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson is not the first person to suggest an international organization, but he is really going to hold on to this idea and insist upon it. And then finally, open diplomacy, that nations should conduct their diplomatic relations in the open, in public. No secret alliances, no secret treaties, keep everything public. When we take a look at the Treaty of Versailles itself, the treaty would be ratified by the European nations in 1919, and it includes many of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, like I said, because he insisted upon it. The League of Nations was created as an international organization designed to help keep the peace. This was supposed to be an arena where nations could work out their differences and conflict without having to resort to the battlefield. Now, an interesting component of the League of Nations Charter, which is part of the Treaty of Versailles, is called Article 10 or Article X, and it requires that members of the League of Nations assist other nations in times of external aggression. So if the League of Nations had existed at the time of the beginning of World War I, then all member nations would have been required to join against Germany. When we take a look at self-determination, it really is unevenly applied. We can see sort of the colonial mentality of Europeans and Americans at this time, in the sense that it seemed okay to require self-determination for maybe the Bosnians or the Polish, but it doesn't apply to, say, the Vietnamese, because those territories were not granted their independence. Germany lost territories, but Britain and France did not. So again, this is applied unevenly throughout the world. The major components that are really problematic for the Treaty of Versailles, first and foremost, Germany must accept full blame for starting the war. And while most people would agree that Germany was definitely an antagonist here, this seems a little harsh. And we'll get to that a little bit later on. The second thing is that Germany would be required to pay $33 billion in reparations. Now, keep in mind, this is $33 billion in 1919. This is an enormous, almost unbelievable amount of money. And in fact, France is insisting on these reparations because it basically wants to bankrupt Germany. The idea here is that Germany would no longer be a world power. And in fact, if Germany had continued to make its reparations payments on time, they would have made the last one in 1989. So coming back to this idea of self-determination, we quite literally redraw the map of Europe following World War I, but self-determination is going to open up a can of worms. So all of the nations in green on this map are new nations. So starting at the top, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Now what's interesting about this is that Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia are made up nations in the sense that they're not made up of one nationality or ethnic group. We could argue to some degree that Poland was more unified in terms of ethnic groups, religion, language, but that's definitely not the case in Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. So this is problematic for a number of reasons, and this will come to haunt people in Europe later on. The biggest problem for the United States is that Woodrow Wilson had gone to the Versailles Peace Conference with a close-knit group of advisors, and all of them were Democrats. Woodrow Wilson makes this huge political blunder by not bringing a single Republican to Versailles. And so when he comes back from the Paris Peace Conference, he is surprised that Republicans are opposed to the Treaty of Versailles. And according to the Constitution, the President of the United States has the authority to make treaties with other nations, but those treaties must be ratified by the Senate. And at this time, the Republicans controlled the Senate. So this is really a bad political move for President Wilson. The Republicans are often described as two different categories of opposition here. The irreconcilables, who were never going to approve the Treaty of Versailles, and those who were looking for some accommodation. They wanted some revision. In particular, many of the senators were concerned about Article 10, this idea that the United States would be bound to participate in future conflicts. And for most of the senators, they had no desire to be drawn into every European conflict from now until kingdom come. And so Woodrow Wilson makes a second political blunder here when he absolutely positively refuses to compromise. He thinks the Treaty of Versailles, partly because he wrote it, is perfect, and that it doesn't need any modifications. And this sort of unwillingness to compromise is really going to be the death of the treaty in the United States. And keep in mind, if the United States doesn't ratify the treaty, then we don't become a member of the League of Nations. So arguably one of the most powerful nations on the planet would not be a part of this international organization. So that's going to sort of doom that organization to failure. Woodrow Wilson does make an attempt to bring his case directly to the American people. He delivered 32 addresses in 22 days, but unfortunately, all of the stress led to a stroke. But Wilson still refused to compromise. And for the next 17 months, his wife, his political aides, and cabinet members kept him isolated from all but the most essential business of the U.S. government. On November 19th, 1919, Congress officially refused to ratify the treaty, and the war came to an official end for the United States as a result of a joint resolution in Congress on May 20th, 1920. So coming back to our questions to think about here, what were the major provisions of the Treaty of Versailles and why were they problematic? One of the key measures of the Treaty of Versailles was the League of Nations. But with Article 10, the United States is going to refuse to ratify it. And so essentially that's going to weaken the League of Nations right from the start. The fate of the territories is problematic because people are discussing the idea of self-determination, but they're not really buying into it fully. There's definitely a sense of racial and colonial considerations on the part of Europeans. The reparations and war guilt clauses of the treaty are going to humiliate Germany. They are going to bankrupt Germany, and those things are going to have serious repercussions moving forward. So coming back to why doesn't the United States Senate ratify the Treaty of Versailles? Mostly because of Article 10. Many of the senators didn't want to join the League of Nations and become committed to being involved in future European conflicts.